Hello everyone, after many eons, it's finally that time. The long-awaited DMC3 review is finally upon us, and boy what a journey it's been. I started this journey with DMC3 set solidly as my favourite Devil May Cry game, but over the course of about 6 different difficulties, with over 100 total hours put into the game over around 10 or 15 playthroughs, my opinions have changed somewhat and become more complex. Now, before any DMC3 fans freak the fuck out, don't worry. I do still love this game, but I also think it's spent so long on a huge golden pedestal in the action game genre and within my own head that a full playthrough on every difficulty, plus some more for grinding, really caused me to re-examine it as well as its strengths and weaknesses, and where it stands in relation to what came both before and after. Devil May Cry 3 already finds itself in a bit of a tough spot, as it has to essentially revive the series from the dead, after the husk that DMC2 was. In order to achieve this, the director, Hideaki Itsuno, and the development team had to go back and examine each of their failures in Devil May Cry 2 and rectify them, whilst incorporating large amounts of what made the first game so beloved. On top of this, they had to evolve and improve upon these positive aspects to create a game that would not only revive the series, but also be its strongest entry. So, how well did they achieve this? Well, let's find out.
No doubt you've got some fun planned for me. Right, Vergil?
Before I begin the review properly, I'd like to make 2 main disclaimers, as I feel that these are issues that may be raised or are contextually relevant in terms about how I feel about certain design decisions. First, though I have played this game many times, I do not consider myself a pro by any means, and I admit there's probably many things that pros can either circumvent or use to their advantage that would be annoying for a typical player like me to handle. However, being able to circumvent something because of hundreds of hours of game knowledge doesn't make it not a bad design decision, if it is one. Although people are absolutely free to disagree with my takes if there's something obvious that I missed, which there may well be. The second point is that while trying to 100% the game, I had my original 60+ hour save file corrupted, causing me to have to replay this game several more times than I initially anticipated. This has caused some major DMC burnout while recording for this video and may affect some of my takes. However, I feel that this isn't enough of a major factor to massively overwrite my opinion, as I'm perfectly capable of playing games that I adore 10 plus times back to back, and I do believe that my burnout within this game comes from a fundamental lack of replayability on its part, which I'll get to. Anyway, as the key aspect at the core of Devil May Cry's success, in order to successfully revitalize the series, Devil May Cry 3's combat would have to absolutely wow players, while building on what had come before. To begin with, the game features a reworked Alastor and Ifrit, in the form of Rebellion and Beowulf, as well as 3 brand new and unique weapons for Dante to make use of. These are obtained for beating certain main story bosses, essentially acting as rewards for progressing through the game, with each new weapon having its own set niche that brought an interesting layer to combat. Rebellion and Beowulf, as previously stated, served much the same purpose as Alastor and Ifrit before them, with one being a high-speed mid-ranged weapon and the other being a short-ranged but extremely powerful beatdown tool. Cerberus and Agni and Rudra then act as the game's combo machines, with a larger degree of skill required to learn them, but the reward of even longer and more stylish combos. On that subject, the combo system from Devil May Cry 1 makes its deserved return, with delays in button inputs during attacks resulting in new and varied combo outputs. However, the major improvement made to this system is the ability to seamlessly switch between 2 main equipped weapons, even mid-combo, and produce a virtually infinite number of unique results. This system rewards a player the more they experiment and engage with each of the game's weapons, and each of these weapons feels satisfying and fun to fight with in its own right. None of them really have glaring issues that prevent them from being usable, and that cannot be overcome through a greater understanding of that weapon, or simply by combining it with another that covers that weapon's inherent weaknesses. At least, that's what I'd like to say, if there wasn't too many issues. Viewers familiar with DMC3 already may have noticed that I left out one major weapon, Nevan, a scythe/electric guitar hybrid that acts as a weird zoning tool, which spams attacks from afar but also has this big AoE blast around you, which I assume is meant to be a method of keeping enemies away, but rarely ever works. The problem essentially is that this weapon's moveset is slow, far too slow to be efficiently comboed in with any of the other game's main weapons, and it lacks a lot of versatility and fun within its design, although again, I do not profess to be anything near a pro at this game, so it is possible I don't understand it, but every time I've tried it, I found it extremely lackluster and unfun to use. Worse still, instead of the delayed button combos of other weapons, it uses directional inputs, a holdover from Devil May Cry 2's combat system, which are deeply flawed, essentially because of the way the game's camera works. See, one major aspect that Devil May Cry 1 attempts to improve on from its predecessors is its camera. Instead of being fully fixed, the player can now turn the camera to a small degree either way, as well as having a much improved lock-on system. The problem is that this doesn't entirely fix the issue, as the camera still has the Devil May Cry 1 issue of abruptly switching between perspectives, very frequently in some areas. This has the effect of completely throwing you off when it happens, and rendering directional inputs completely useless. So yeah, thanks to these 2 issues, Nevan feels completely unusable, as every enemy either invalidates your range advantage by being faster or by ganging up on you. On that subject though, ranged weapons have gone through some significant changes, and are now well integrated into the combat system in my opinion. Ebony and Ivory now don't really do terribly significant damage, and act primarily as a way of juggling enemies to keep up the style meter, or as a method of maintaining damage on an enemy whilst repositioning. This is absolutely perfect, as it allows the guns to feel like a central part of the game's combat loop, as they should be, but it uses their implementation to encourage you to use them in concert with the game's melee weapons, rather than instead of them. As for the range of other guns you get over the course of the game, such as the usual beam cannon, shotgun, and my favourite thing ever, they, much like the melee weapons, all have their own uses and niches within the game's combat system. However, despite Devil May Cry 3's range of weapons with different niches, the inability to change weapon loadouts mid-level does result in an almost opportunity cost-like mindset. As you play through the game, you realise that certain weapons perform far more poorly against certain enemies, and particularly I found many of the ranged weapons struggle to deal with many common enemy types, or at least deal with them in a way that was more efficient than just spamming Ebony and Ivory. Now granted, there are statues placed at certain points within the levels that allow you to switch weapons, which does mitigate some of that issue, but it doesn't change the fact that not every weapon is integrated into the combat as well, and the lack of constant ability to switch dependent on a situation just reinforces picking a favourite set and sticking with it. Now, for the truly important question. Devil Trigger. It's been absolutely busted to the point of being the only state in which you can play the game on higher difficulties for the last 2 games straight. So, how is it here? Well, first of all, it drains at a far higher rate, so you spend less time in that state and don't have the same ridiculous damage output that you do in other games. However, you do still heal, deal increased damage with your attacks, and move faster. This state works more as a short boost of power to be strategically used mid-combo to gain as much DPS as possible, rather than just something to be spammed to kill everything instantly. This is because the lack of any overwhelming benefits to its usage means that just popping it randomly to whack an enemy can often end up being a waste. To balance out the loss of power Devil Trigger is experienced though, as well as giving you an option for if enemies begin to swarm around you and give you no space to attack, there's DT Burst. This effectively works by having you sacrifice most of your meter after a significant charge up time in exchange for an AoE explosion that does insane damage, and can usually kill the basic enemies on most difficulties in one hit. However, it does completely use up your meter and isn't that effective on most bosses outside of their specific weak states, so you have to strategically plan how you use it. So far though, we've mainly seen how DMC3 improves on already existing systems, but does it add anything new of value to the DMC formula? Indeed it does, for it's here that we see the advent of the revolutionary stance system, a set of 4 stances that drastically improve upon aspects of Dante's kit and require you to change your playstyle around them. There's Trickster, which gives Dante a real fucking dodge button, as well as massively increasing his maneuverability in all areas. There's Swordmaster, which adds new and wonderfully stylish moves to your melee weapons to improve combos, and similarly Gunslinger, which adds the exact same thing but for ranged weapons. And then finally there's Royal Guard, which adds a fucking parry to Devil May Cry. All of these are unique and fun in their own right, and all have their own distinct uses. However, DMC3 only allows you to use 1 stance at a time in a mission, unless you're playing on the Devil's Box. So using a variety of approaches to combat using these stances is immediately hamstrung. Additionally, due to this, it becomes far more worth it to simply stick with 1 stance for an entire playthrough in the hopes of raising it to max level, as you've now again got this unavoidable element of opportunity cost, essentially meaning that the stance you pick to run through a level has to be the most fun to use and most capable of dealing with enemies on that level. This essentially forces a choice between the 2 main defensive stances, Royal Guard and Trickster, as Dante has no real defensive options to deal with some of these attacks otherwise. This choice is essentially cut down to just Trickster though, as Royal Guard is fun to use but it severely limits your maneuverability, which is essential for most fights, and for navigating large portions of the platformer segments in the game. Also, it requires more playtime to actively master. This is a massive shame, as literally just including the ability to switch would completely remove this issue and exponentially increase your options in combat. This, along with the inconsistency in some weapons, as well as the camera still largely being an issue, is why I believe DMC3's combat is still fundamentally flawed, although it is a massive improvement on what has gone before. All these tools do build towards the greater goal of improving the style system, and allowing you more options to increase it. See, in the older games, you just spam random buttons and the style meter would just kind of go up the more times you hit something. Now, however, you're encouraged to use every combo, weapon, and tool in your arsenal in order to keep the meter as high as possible, and spamming the same attack will cause it to decay, which has the effect of constantly keeping you active during combat and rewards you for engaging with every facet of the combat system as much as possible. Overall, despite some small issues, it is a really strong improvement on what has gone before in my opinion. However, the inability to dynamically switch stances and weapons does drag it down a bit for me. Regardless though, this has still been the most fun Dante has been to play in any of the Devil May Cry games so far. With any good combat system though, you need an equally solid system of progression that rewards you for completing the game's many challenges, with additional skills and tools to enrich gameplay. Devil May Cry 3 handles this by returning mainly to Devil May Cry 1's system of red orbs being collected from defeated enemies. The amount of red orbs you collect is dependent on the stylish meter you gain from that enemy, rewarding players for trying bigger and flashier combos. Furthermore, to that end, the player is awarded a ranking at the end of every mission, based on the time it took them to complete it, the stylish points they racked up, and how much damage they took. A ranking which is then rewarded with increasingly high amounts of red orbs based on how good it is. These red orbs can then be used to buy healing items at the shop, upgrade weapons, and purchase new skills. Long gone is the abjectly boring system of spending red orbs to give weapons flat damage upgrades, we're back to fun and unique skills that enhance each weapon's playstyle, baby. Dante can also buy purple orbs from the shop, which upgrade his Devil Trigger meter. My only issue with this being it would be a bit more fun if they were scattered around in world as blue orbs are, to make them feel more like an upgrade you actually have to work for, and therefore more like an actual part of the game. Speaking of blue orbs, they work the same as always, by upgrading your max health if you find 4 fragments or 1 full one. You can buy up to 4 at the shop, and the rest is split between hidden locations in world and secret missions. Their locations strike a nice balance between being nigh impossible to find like in Devil May Cry 1 and a cakewalk like in Devil May Cry 2 in my opinion, which marks a nice improvement. The progression system in general is a solid consolidation on what was already a pretty flawless system in Devil May Cry 1, and is one of the main areas that Devil May Cry 3 honestly perfects. However, I do still have one small gripe. One repeatedly weird gameplay decision that these games keep making. Why the fuck is Air Hike locked behind a paywall? Air Hike, for those who don't know, is essentially this game's double jump, which, thanks to the emphasis the game often puts on platforming, feels like a pretty essential skill. A skill that is locked behind a 20k or red orb paywall, a sizable sum for your first playthrough. And that's forgetting the fact that you have to unlock it on weapons individually, and that it can only be unlocked on 3 out of 5 of the game's weapons. This is such a strange design decision to me, as Air Hike is less a non-essential tool purposefully designed to act as a reward that makes gameplay more fun as the other upgrades are. Air Hike instead is pretty much an essential part of Dante's kit that is just missing on roundabout 2/5 of his weapons, further incentivizing the player away from using them, and then put behind a paywall that essentially forces the player to get it before they can actually move on to getting new moves to their weapons. Again though, this is mainly a minor personal gripe and doesn't majorly distract from the fact that this is still the best a DMC progression system has been so far in the series. Every solid progression combat system needs enemies that test the player's skill and act as fulfilling and enjoyable obstacles to overcome. And it's on this front which I think that DMC3 honestly kind of fails to deliver. To begin with, we have the Hail Jailers, 7 unique Grim Reaper-like enemies with designs and attacks all themed after a deadly sin. Individually, they're not really a threat until you reach Dante Must Die difficulty, but each one complements the others to form what is essentially a single coherent enemy. For example, the tanky but slow Hell Sloths tank damage, while faster enemies dash in and attack you from behind. This kind of design allows individual enemies to be quickly and stylishly dealt with, but forces you to be aware and wary of the capabilities of everything you're fighting. This all sounds good, right? So where's the problem? Well, the problems start occurring with everything else on Devil May Cry 3's enemy roster, which either returns to the brutally unfun gimmicks of the first 2 games, see Blood Goyles, Soul Eaters, or Fallen, or lumps the most passive and boring cardboard box enemy you've ever fought against right on your lap. See the Chessmen and the Dullahans. Imagine for a second, imagine a gaseous, flying enemy that's invincible while you're facing it, and can therefore only be attacked by repeatedly turning away and then shooting it, or by spamming the jumping attack on Beowulf. Oh, and we gave it a one-shot grab. And it can teleport. And by the way, that one-shot grab, only cancelable if you have DT. What a fun design! And although that's definitely the worst DMC3 has to offer, far too many enemies on the roster have at least some gimmick like that, from phasing through walls to only being damaged by hitting a big Resident Evil-esque big glowy spot. It completely drains the fun out of playing the game for me, as the emphasis once again is taken away from style and placed on knowing how to best exploit a specific gimmick. It's such a disappointment, especially considering how fun the combat is, and can make the game a real slog on higher difficulties, and on Dante Must Die, I'll be honest, abjectly impossible. It also marks the one area of the game where that good old Devil May Cry 2 design philosophy can really be felt, and I just don't enjoy that. Moving on though, how are the bosses? Well, overall, they're amazing. Ignoring Vergil for a moment, don't worry, we'll come back to him. We have bangers like Beowulf, Nevan, and Cerberus. Each of these bosses represent peak Devil May Cry boss design in my opinion, as while they incorporate some of the elements of that gimmick design I really do hate in most bosses in this series, the gimmicks they use don't render their boss fights unenjoyable. as they can either be overcome pretty easily like with Cerberus's Ice, or are fundamentally fun to play around because they allow a range of responses from the player. A perfect example of this is Nevan's bats, which do make her invulnerable but can be destroyed either by shooting them or with a melee attack. This encourages the player to make a decision between the safe option of shooting from range but taking way longer, or engaging in timed melee attacks in order to maintain their style meter. Encouraging the player to make risk versus reward decisions like this, instead of just having one set method of beating them, is the hallmark of a great boss, and can be applied to almost all of Devil May Cry 3's excellent roster. Almost. Because for some reason, someone at the office was allowed to cook and create these fucking abominations. I really hate to have to say it, but just as Devil May Cry 3 has some of the highest boss highs in the series, it also has some of the highest boss lows. Gigapede, Leviathan, and Arkham are once again a return to that good old DMC2 drudgery, with bosses that either barely interact with you or just spam you with minor enemies until you die. Gigapede in particular is in the running for Devil May Cry's worst boss in my opinion, which with Devil May Cry 2's entire lineup, a stiff competition, is pretty fucking impressive. This completely fucking stupid worm just flies through tunnels, periodically spamming you with one of two ranged attack types, the only interruptions, by the way, in an otherwise completely mind-numbingly boring boss fight, with no actual reason to exist. Seriously, why is this thing even a boss? It's genuinely never even addressed. Dante doesn't even interact with it at all, so it's just effectively a filler boss added in to increase playtime, I guess. Regardless of its purpose though, it's a real letdown from the otherwise mostly stellar quality of this game's bosses. But enough beating around the bush with the unimportant fodder. I know what you want to know. How's the funny blue man, the master of motivation himself, Vergil? Well, I'm sure I'm not the first person to say this, but he's absolutely amazing. He's effectively supposed to be this refinement of Devil May Cry 1's best boss, Nilo Angelo, which mirrored aspects of Dante's moveset in order to produce an almost PvP-like experience, which is what Vergil delivers, albeit with more variation than his Devil May Cry 1 counterpart. His three fights offer up their own unique set of challenges while building on each other beautifully. A perfect example of this is how his arena evolves over your three fights with him. As the first two fights, the arena is kind of in your favor, as most of Vergil's attacks come in straight lines, and the first two arenas you fight him in are circular. This means you have more room to effectively kite and dodge his attacks, as well as keeping him at range, while watching for his tells. However, your third fight with him is skewed in his favour, as you square off in an almost Western-style duel, where you stand at opposite ends of a relatively thin strip of riverbed. This gives you far less room to kite out his attacks, and forces you to manage your distance from him more effectively, especially as he gains several potentially lethal ranged attacks, and a terrifying second phase. We're only like halfway through this review series, but I honestly believe this is the best Devil May Cry fight right here. The tension, the reliance on nothing but your own wits and quick reactions, and the beautifully realized fantasy of fighting an equal all combines to form honestly one of the most fun experiences you can have in a game. As for DMC3's approach to level design, the director and development team seem to have learned from their initial misstep in Devil May Cry 2, where levels were nothing but empty, vapid expanses. Levels are now mostly set within a series of medium to small sized areas, with larger connective areas like the base of the tower's nexus. Effectively the same as how Devil May Cry 1 handled it, albeit without the accursed underwater levels. Finally, there are no combat arenas which feel too large or too small, in my opinion, as they all straddle the middle ground between being too large and too cramped very effectively. The same can be said of boss arenas, as I've already mentioned how Vergil's arena perfectly complements his fights in my opinion. The only really sucky combat arenas I can think of are more hamstrung by the enemies or bosses contained within them, rather than the arenas themselves. The only notable exception to which is Gigapede's boss arena, which not only sees you fight him, but also several very unenjoyable encounters throughout the course of a game, in a space that feels very reminiscent of those empty, boring combat arenas from Devil May Cry 2 I mentioned earlier. As for exploration and the collectibles rewarded for it, there are three main things to find. First, there are the blue orb fragments, which I've already mentioned, and their locations are a lot better balanced than in previous games in terms of ease of discovery, so you could likely find them all without the use of a guide. but they do require you to actively search the level for a bit. We also have the secret missions, which reward you with blue orb fragments. These are much better signposted in this game, instantly registering as obvious items of interest if you're looking for them in most cases. For example, the big crystal skull in Mission 10. As for how they play, they incorporate a much wider range of challenges than the previous 2 games, testing things such as your ability to stay airborne for 20 seconds, or taking out a group of enemies without being hit. They're on the whole a lot more fun, I'd say, but their difficulty is also a lot more punishing, which does make sense for a secret mission, but can also stand as a bit of an annoying and unnecessary barrier between you and completing your health bar. These, I think, should reward you with something other than blue orbs, as 2 of the game's sets of collectibles already offer these rewards. Finally, there's the combat adjudicators, which also reward you with blue orb fragments in exchange for reaching a stylish ranking with a certain weapon. I really like these, as they test your mastery of Dante's arsenal very fairly, as well as actively rewarding it. They're also placed in very obvious locations, so your only real obstacle in terms of beating them is your own fundamental understanding of the game's combat, which I think is really fun. In terms of overall structure, Devil May Cry 3 follows the same mission layout as the previous entries, with 20 missions in total. These missions all revolve around defeating a set boss or solving a simple puzzle, like finding your way to 3 sort of hidden key items. However, due to being pretty similar to especially Devil May Cry 1 in terms of mission goals, Devil May Cry 3 does suffer from its problem of occasionally feeling extremely repetitive, as there's no real variety to mission goals, other than just simply running around, grabbing key items and putting them in places. Yes, I know that's simply the overall framework for the game to take place within, but more variation is kinda needed in my opinion, as levels start to feel really samey, especially in the disappointing stretch between the defeat of Vergil for the 2nd time and the fight with Doppelganger, where 5-ish missions straight are just spent running around and getting things to put in places. Nothing happens in any of these missions, as you just mark your slow ascent up the tower. Again, overall I'd say pacing and variety is one of the areas in which Devil May Cry 3 fails to improve on the mistakes of the past games the most. Although it should be clarified, I'm not really saying the levels in Devil May Cry 3 suck, just that they don't really build or improve upon the mistakes of past games in any meaningful way. One of the many criticisms that was levied at Devil May Cry 2 after its release concerned its difficulty, or lack thereof. Particularly the fact that the entire game could be beaten without even really engaging with the game's combat, and just spamming the guns. Well, director Hideaki Atsuno seems to have taken that real personal, as Devil May Cry 3 marks a return to the same punishing and mostly fun difficulty spikes of the first entry. Normal mode is a fair challenge when you first play it, provided you aren't using items, and acts as a decently punishing but fair introduction to the game's combat, enemies, and bosses. However, replaying the game on increasingly high difficulties is an integral part of the main Devil May Cry experience, and is the reason why the games are usually quite short, at around 4 to 5 hours I think, which ensures that the game is as replayable as possible, with each difficulty ramping up the health and damage of the enemies and bosses. It also changes up enemy spawn locations between hard and very hard, and increases the amount of certain enemy types that appear in certain locations. This rising difficulty spike crescendos with Dante Must Die, the ultimate challenge. Here, enemies do about a quarter of your health with one attack, have improved AI, and access to their own Devil Trigger state. This all sounds like a theoretically fun challenge, being asked to stylishly dispatch enemies who have every conceivable advantage over you, using the skills previous difficulties have taught you. However, there's one main issue that causes Devil May Cry 3's DMD mode to be fundamentally just sort of unfun in my opinion. See, enemies in Dante Must Die mode also get ungodly tanky, which means that you've actively spent like 5 minutes comboing each one, while a horde of other tanky enemies interrupts you constantly. This adds this really unenjoyable element of artificial difficulty in my opinion, as fights become these elongated and drawn out wars of attrition that end up tripping you up more simply because of their length than because of their actual difficulty. Their ability to get Devil Trigger adds another layer of frustration to this, as enemies gain the ability to poise tank through many of your attacks, as well as an even larger health bar, which makes fighting them even more drawn out and annoying. This isn't even particularly bad on most of the basic Hell Jailer enemies, as again, again, most of them are well designed enough that enough awareness means that you can basically learn to deal with these encounters. The problem gets real bad though when facing those poorly designed enemies I mentioned earlier, which are only somewhat salvageable in the base game because of their smallish health bars, which are now dialed up to 11 on Dante Must Die, making them effectively miserable to fight. Enemy DT mode also works differently than in previous games, somewhat to my frustration, as enemies no longer have a timer before they go Devil Trigger mode, so you can simply beat them before they transform, which is a very fun test of your skills, effectively asking you to speedrun every encounter as stylishly as possible. However, now Devil Trigger is automatically activated on certain enemies based on how many you've killed. Now, you can still mess around with this system, but mostly that's to do with just, oh, I will prioritize this incredibly destructive enemy type first to ensure that it doesn't get Devil Trigger. But the problem is, everything's infuriating in this game when it gets Devil Trigger, and there are only like 2 or 3 combat encounters where that kind of prioritization actually matters. The old system I feel was superior in terms of fair difficulty, as it rewarded players who could quickly and efficiently deal with the game's combat encounters instead of effectively punishing you for playing. In terms of replayability, there's also the added option to play in yellow or gold orb mode. The difference being that in yellow orb mode, each death resets you to the beginning of the mission. This, in my opinion, makes the game a whole lot less fun, especially on Dante Must Die, as the game becomes this slow trudge repeatedly doing the same encounters over and over if you die even once. And the game doesn't really feel like it was balanced with you resetting back to the beginning of the mission after every death in mind. There's also Bloody Palace mode, completely revamped and upgraded from the shoddy experience it was in Devil May Cry 2. There's now actually fun and distinct arenas. Boss fights now happen in their proper areas instead of being crammed into spaces that don't fit them, and the difficulty curve is a lot more well handled. Additionally, items are banned, but you have the choice to replenish your DT and health at the cost of ascending up the Bloody Palace's floors a bit slower, which is a fun mechanic which forces you to weigh up risk versus reward. Overall, I've played this game about 14 times, so I can't say the replayability factor isn't there in a big way, but I do think the game hits its actual fun peak at very hard mode, instead of Dante Must Die as it intends. The game can also feel very repetitive because of that lack of variation in mission design as I mentioned before, a holdover from the series' earlier entries. Hello, this is Editing Jockey. While script writing for this video, I almost completely forgot you can even play as Vergil. How silly of me, how goofy. Yeah, he's pretty fun. I'm just annoyed there is absolutely no variation in his campaign at all in terms of adding new cutscenes or even bothering to add Dante in as a special boss encounter. So you just get recolored Vergil. Woo. He can also feel a bit weird to navigate the early platforming focused levels on, considering you don't have air hike, but that is again honestly outweighed by his fun factor in combat, where he trades out a lot of the moving parts of Dante's arsenal for sheer power and devastating attacks, which feel gorgeous to use. Again, just wish there was a bit more to his story.
You showed up.
You sure know how to throw a party. No food, no drinks, and the only babe just left.
My sincerest apology, brother. I was so eager to see you, I couldn't concentrate on preparations for the bash.
Whatever. At any rate, it's been a whole year since we last met. How about a kiss from your little brother? Or better yet, how about a kiss from this?
Now let's start discussing the story and characters. Where both DMC1 and 2 focused on an older, mature, and often quite edgy Dante, Devil May Cry 3 takes us back to the past, before the Devil May Cry hunting agency was even formed, and to a much younger and more immature Dante. A Dante who runs around shirtless and relentlessly taunts every demon he comes up against. At the beginning of the game, he gets an anonymous call and has his shop attacked by a horde of demons. After swiftly dispatching them, a demonic tower arises from the ground. The Temen Negru, summoned by his brother Vergil, who he has a bitter rivalry with, spurring Dante to ascend the tower in order to fight him. Vergil is assisted in his mission by Arkham, a mysterious and downright weird fucking fella who wanders around going, "Demon, demon, darkness, demon's tower, and acts as the secondary antagonist. His daughter, Lady, also climbs the tower, equipped with a fucking bazooka with a bayonet attached. She seems equally bitter and also wishes to ascend the tower to stop her father. And that's about the size of it. Another extremely simple plot setup in my DMC game. Who'd have thunk it, right? However, what's most immediately interesting about Devil May Cry 3 is there's more moving parts than other DMC games, with a few more major characters, and therefore more opportunities to explore the themes and ideas of the DMC series through them. It is overall an excellent story in my opinion, for many reasons, mainly to do with how it interacts with and explores Devil May Cry's themes, while maintaining a relatively simple story, and is this game's strongest asset in my opinion. Now that's it for non-spoiler territory, I'm afraid. Everything after this will be discussing those, so if you don't wish to be spoiled, skip to this timestamp. In terms of the story's pacing, it's split into a pretty cut and dry 3-act structure, with each story act's end being marked by a fight with Vergil. There's the opening 7 missions, which follows Dante's first ascent up the tower and his first skirmish with Vergil, after which he unlocks his Devil Trigger. The second act then has him dive to the tower's subterranean basement to stop Vergil from unlocking its central purpose. Finally, the third act revolves around Dante chasing Arkham back up a shifting and rapidly collapsing tower, in order to reach him before he attains godhood, culminating in the ultimate Western-style standoff between him and Vergil. Thankfully, in contrast to the game's missions, the story feels well-defined and well-paced, with the only real issue I have being the lack of location variety in the majority of the third act. The story benefits heavily from its relative simplicity in a structural sense, as there are no real wasted cutscenes in my opinion, and it gets its major intended messages through to the player clearly and concisely. There's only really 1 or 2 major shocker reveals that I can think of, and they all feel pretty well set up in my opinion, especially Arkham's betrayal of Vergil at the second act's climax. But what about the characters? DMC and most character action games in general mostly carry themselves not on the weight and complexity of their plots, but instead on the likability and fun present within their characters. Devil May Cry 1 and 2 struggle with this severely, as I've already elaborated in their respective reviews, and it really held those games back in terms of enjoyment for me. So how does Devil May Cry 3 perform? Well, for a start, Dante's character was finally nailed down in this game, and no longer hovers awkwardly between sassy and edgy in the middle of scenes. Here he's consistently an arrogant prick, but lovably so, as all of his dialogue beautifully straddles the lines between being entertainingly snarky and genuinely heartfelt when the story demands it of him. Devil May Cry 3 also handles these otherwise jarring character changes by framing it within this coming-of-age arc, where Dante begins the game arrogant and overly self-confident. However, he later learns that his power should be used to protect others, as well as his familial responsibility to stop Vergil's power-hungry schemes. Thanks to this, we finally get a game where Dante meaningfully grows as a character between the start and end. Wild, I know, right? And we get the contrast of his arrogance and apathy with which he faces off against Vergil for the first time, with the sheer passion and heartfelt desperation he shows in their final duel. I know it's somewhat simple as character arcs go, but sometimes simple is best. As for Vergil, well, despite my better nature, I'm not going to write 2,000 words about him here. That can come later. But long story short, he's an extremely fun villain, with a surprising amount of subtextual depth you wouldn't expect from the brooding Katana Man. His solemn silence in cutscenes, for example, implies a level of remorse in working with demons to undo his father's legacy, but that he sees it as a means to an end in order to gain greater power, a detachment which reflects Dante's own initial emotional distance from the events taking place. Beyond his writing quality as his rival, he perfectly matches Dante in every aspect. He kicks ass just as entertainingly, shit talks just as well, and above all is just fun to watch. What more could you want? Devil May Cry 3 also provides us with our first truly well-written female deuteragonist in the series, in the form of Lady, a badass bayonet bazooka-wielding woman with absolutely zero patience for Dante's bullshit. Her quest for revenge on Arkham formed the main emotional and thematic core of Devil May Cry 3, as it's her story that directly inspires Dante's shift in character. She's also just a normal human being taking on demonic horrors with nothing but pure grit and determination, an archetype I have always always found extremely fun. She represents the good in humanity, with her determination to make her father pay for his actions despite her own lack of power, making her a wonderfully unique character within Devil May Cry's roster in my opinion. Her father, Arkham, is the perfect dark reflection of her in that sense, as he has sacrificed nearly everything in his life in pursuit of godhood. Through this sacrifice, he has come to hold a great amount of power, including the ability to summon and control demons. He also acts as an interesting thematic counterpoint to Vergil, a reflection of what a desire to gain power at any cost can do to a person and their relationships with others. But more than that, he's just a very fun villain in my opinion, and genuinely one of Devil May Cry's most underrated characters. Both are excellent, and greatly improve the story and the exploration of its themes with their presence. This also marks the beginning of Devil May Cry being able to pull off having a range of interesting characters other than just Dante. Much like its story, Devil May Cry 3's characters are also fairly simple at first glance, but that belies a surprising amount of complexity that can be found within their characterization, as well as a very interesting level of interaction with the overall themes of Devil May Cry as a series. Part of the reason these characters work so well in my opinion is the fact that the dialogue feels like it's finally hit the right niche between being goofy when it wants to be and serious where it needs to be. Yeah, certain lines feel melodramatic, but then again this isn't meant to be a highly grounded story, so those lines tend to fit well within Devil May Cry's overall tone without being so ridiculous that they feel out of place. A great amount of characterization can also be found within subtextual details in the way characters hold themselves in cutscenes, as with Vergil's aforementioned regret over undoing his father's legacy. These characters are also all genuinely fun to watch on top of being competently written, and all get to have standout moments within the story. It is, in my opinion, the best cast in the Devil May Cry game, and it's another aspect that honestly carries large portions of it.
I've come all this way. I'm sure you have time for one more game, right?
Why not? After all, we share the same blood. I'll just use more of yours to undo Daddy's little spell.
So, you want a piece of me, literally? Okay, bro. Come and get it, if you can.
So how has the game aged aesthetically? Well, usually in these reviews I don't like to harp on about graphics, since those are inherently going to age and become outdated from a technical perspective. However, in terms of how the game has aged, it's aged like a fine wine in most areas, and still looks pretty good. Although there are places where choices made with the game's presentation have caused it to age more like milk, especially in the locations where this weird blur effect is added to the screen for no reason. Cutscenes in particular though still look amazing. Partially because of the HD remaster, but also because of the motion capture that was used to help animate them. As for the actual art direction, the game can often feel lacking in terms of vibrancy and colour in its environments and enemies, a problem similar to what Devil May Cry 2 experienced, as largely the game's designs are made up of dry, muted tones, with admittedly a few exceptions, which can make the game's designs feel somewhat dull. Although this may be a stylistic choice, as the lack of vibrancy is then contrasted by Dante's presence in his big luminous red coat. To its credit though, Devil May Cry 3 also has a really solid set of character designs that effectively communicate a lot about their respective characters. For example, Dante's coat continues to present ideas about his character through its design, with his now bare chest indicating a lack of restraint as well as a lack of maturity and immense sense of arrogance. Vergil's design by contrast is more closed off, and also makes use of contrasting colours to communicate the differences between the two, with Dante's bright red coat evoking a sense of passion and warmth, whereas Vergil's blue demonstrates his cold and detached nature. However, the inner lining of Vergil's coat is actually a reddish orange, implying that beneath his cold exterior lies the same passion and fire that drives Dante. A similar concept can be found in how the game's other main pair, Lady and Arkham, also have interesting black and white dominated designs respectively, with Lady's emphasis on white reflecting her purity, particularly the purity of intention to defeat Arkham, and Arkham's black priestly getup reflecting his corruption. Similar to Vergil's design, Arkham's design also plays around with expectations, not only with the whole holy worshipping the profane implications of a man wearing priest robes attempting to become king of hell, but through how the somber black of his robes clash with his true maniacal personality, which is demonstrated through Jester. I will expand more on my thoughts on these designs in a future video, so please keep an eye out for that if you're interested. But for now, I'll just say that on the whole, they're both iconic and excellently put together for the most part within this game. In addition to having some banger character designs, most of Devil May Cry 3's enemies continue to look both cool and explore the themes of the series in a variety of interesting ways. Funnily enough, this is particularly evident within most of the enemies I mentioned really disliking earlier, like Soul Eaters and Fallen, as their unique designs do have a lot to unpack and are quite visually fun. It's just a shame they absolutely fucking suck to fight. As for the Hell Jailers, they do have a few interesting things going on, but feel quite samey after 7 iterations on a design, with most not really having any major tie to the sin they're supposed to represent, which is a shame considering it is a really fun idea. And the chessmen are, unfortunately, pretty much just bland and basic interpretations of chess pieces without much actual flair added in. Apart from some blandness in the more common enemy designs though, the game has a real problem with visual clarity when fighting enemies, I find. Particularly enemies with large effects surrounding them, such as Soul Eater Mist or Hell Vanguard's Cloak, which tend to blot out large portions of the screen, which can get really annoying when enemies attack you through those blind spots. Bosses on the whole though look amazing, with designs like Cerberus and Nevan being some of the most memorable the series has produced. However, the exceptions that do exist really drag the game's designs down. There's obviously the weird purple fetus blob Arkham, Leviathan Heart, and whatever the fuck Gigapede is supposed to be. These are bosses which don't necessarily ruin the overall quality of the roster, but act as blemishes on an otherwise flawless set of designs. As for the environments, they're generally serviceable. Arenas each feel unique and distinct, but you do get this really fun sense of the tower's overall structure through them. However, as I continued to play, I couldn't help but feel like they were somewhat lacking in personality and detail compared to the first game. As while I maintained the tone of that game's areas was completely mismatched with the rest of the game, they had a level of detail and attention paid to their design which I do sorely feel is lacking from 3. Rooms in the castle all felt like they had their own histories, and you could almost get a sense of a story being told through the environment, even the more batshit ones like the Ghost Ship. In contrast, most of the Temen Negru's areas feel weird and purposeless, and while there are a few exceptions, particularly with beautifully designed boss arenas like Nevan's underground opera house and the first tower top battle with Vergil, the entire tower rarely feels like a location with history being told through its environments, which is odd to me, considering this tower does actually have a very explicit story, compared with DMC1's castle. Areas in this game, in an aesthetic sense, feel awkwardly caught between trying for the same gothic vibe as the castle, but without the gloomy and oppressive atmosphere, resulting in a location that mostly feels very dry and devoid of atmosphere, in my opinion. The levels also don't bear reuse as well as the castle's interior, as the changes made to these areas on revisits are often either A, minor, or B, make those areas actively worse. The area design overall is something I feel that hasn't been majorly improved on, at least in terms of visual flair from Devil May Cry 2, and is honestly one of this game's weakest points in my opinion. The soundtrack of Devil May Cry 3 though is primarily full of bangers, with boss themes particularly absolutely going. Then of course there's the infamous Devils Never Cry, which works beautifully as a central theme song for Dante's progression throughout the game, and is even remixed in several ways to accompany differing scenes. The only real main complaint I have is the main battle theme, which while being a perfectly serviceable and action-packed piece of music, did really start to grate on me after being repeated in nearly every known boss encounter you have. As for the sound design, the game features a wide variety of audio cues specific to each enemy and boss that fairly telegraph every attack they're about to perform, with the best example being found in Nevan's boss fight. It even gets to the point where you can tell how many hits a boss like Vergil has left in his vulnerable state by the sound he makes when you attack him, which I think is incredibly fun and rewards a player the more they pay attention to every detail of a boss's design, while being something you can fairly easily pick up through repetition on your first playthrough. However, the central problem with this design comes again with clarity in large fights, where often hordes of large enemies attack simultaneously, and it can become incredibly difficult to focus on their individual tells. As for vocal performances, they're pretty much excellent across the board, with Ruben Langdon's Dante and Daniel Southworth's Vergil in particular becoming iconic performances, leading to them to continuing to play those characters for the remainder of the franchise. But a particular unsung hero of this game I feel is Adam D. Clark, who plays a really wonderful Arkham and Jester, splitting between these two completely diametrically opposed roles and carrying both off wonderfully, and genuinely transforming Arkham into what I feel is one of the most underrated characters in the entirety of Devil May Cry.
We are the sons of Sparta. Within each of us flows his blood, but more importantly, his soul! And now, my soul is saying it wants to stop you!
Unfortunately, our souls are at odds, brother. I need more power.
And we're supposed to be twins.
Twins. Right.
So, after all that, how do I feel about Devil May Cry 3? Well, my feelings are complex, and somewhat difficult to define. It's a game I came into remembering it fondly from playing it on my PS3 on my granddad's floor, and as being the first Devil May Cry game I ever properly finished. A feeling of nostalgia I think definitely painted a glorified view of this game in my head, that under a critical lens it could never feasibly live up to. I then began to notice that as I kept going, I was becoming burnt out and somewhat bored of playing Devil May Cry 3. Partially because of the additional playthroughs and grinding I hadn't planned on, which admittedly is absolutely nothing to do with the game and entirely my issue, but something else was definitively affecting my experience that I couldn't put my finger on. No matter how many breaks I took, or for how long, the game progressively felt more and more like a trudge. Especially on Dante Must Die mode, with nothing really living up to the sheer enjoyment and fun factor of those first few playthroughs. I then came to realize it was nothing to do with how Dante felt to play, because he felt amazing, the best he ever had, despite what I felt were some weird restrictions on his kit. So what was it? And then it hit me. While playing through, I think, Mission 9 of Dante Must Die, and being repeat jumped by a gang of Spider-Women, I realized the game is fundamentally anti-Dante, especially on higher difficulties. Now, before you click off the video, let me go on a quick tangent to explain what I mean, and I promise I will loop back around to why I think this. See, there's this funny little game called Doom Eternal, which you've never heard of. Doom Eternal has maybe my favorite combat system in a game ever. The reason? Every enemy is as much of a central piece of the combat loop as your tools at defeating them are. Small imps and ghouls that are easily stunned become free sources of ammunition and health, while you constantly have to stay in motion trying to take out bigger targets. And those bigger targets themselves all have multiple strategies to take down, each of which can be chained into defeating another enemy. In a sense, everything in Doom's combat system works together, even on higher difficulties, and it creates this intense and streamlined puzzle where you have the keys to solve every problem you face. It's just up to you to solve those problems properly. And that is the key to living out the gameplay fantasy of just being a big fucking guy beating the ever-loving shit out of demonic hordes. Now I know what you're gonna say. Chucky, they aren't even remotely similar games. What are you on about, you silly little fucker? And yes, they may not be, but the gameplay fantasy is fundamentally the same. You're just a cool guy hunting down a demonic horde, except instead of brutality like in Doom Eternal, you're doing it with style. But Devil May Cry 3's enemies and design decisions in difficulty modes have so many missing puzzle pieces and enemies that feel completely out of place and poorly designed to fight Dante that they feel like they were ripped out of another much worse game and plopped into this one. This is then doubled down on by the bizarre decision in Dante Must Die to make everything a massive damage sponge that can become even more of a damage sponge if you fail to defeat it within a poorly defined time frame. And to clarify, I know you can overcome this with enough skill. However, most enemies in the game just aren't reactive enough to make that skill expression worth it, especially with their ability to sit there and tank damage. See Fallen and Chessmen of all varieties for particularly bad examples of this precept. My fundamental point being that yes, some of the challenges, particularly the bosses, feel very skill incentivized, and they continue to be fun, but most of the basic enemy encounters just become whacking something until it dies, an enemy that very likely has some sort of gimmick to de-incentivize combos or any kind of skill expression, and it's that exact counteraction of the game's fundamental gameplay fantasy that makes it feel anti-Dante in my opinion. However, that criticism mainly applies to its replay value, and although some enemies are definitely just quite unfun to fight on any playthrough, it doesn't outweigh the sheer joyride this game can be if you're playing it casually, experimenting with weapons and abilities to your heart's content. And while I do still have my criticisms, I believe this is a massive improvement on most of the main areas where the other two games struggled. It's got a fun story, with fun characters and exceptionally fun gameplay at times, and what more do you really need if we're being honest? I just wouldn't recommend absolutely sweating it unless you come to really deeply love this game, in which case you will find a very deep and rich combat system which people are still finding new ways to fuck around with even today. For me though, I think it'll forever be a game I revisit for 1 or 2 playthroughs. As always, thanks for watching. I know it's been a little bit on the longer side, but I did have quite a lot to say about this game. An unexpected amount. It's definitely been a real wild card in terms of how my feelings have shifted from adoration to annoyance for a little bit, and now to what I hope is a pretty reasonable understanding of the game's big pros, as well as where it suffers. If you'd like to see my expanded thoughts and feelings on this game's designs and thematics, I'll be making a follow-up video to this video very soon analysing those. But until then, it has been an absolute pleasure, boyos, and I'll see you in the next one.